What if I told you that one of the most daring assassination missions of World War II wasn't carried out by an army, a squadron, or an elite intelligence agency, but by just two men dropped from the sky into the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe? What if I told you that their target was one of the most feared figures in Hitler's regime, known to friend and enemy alike as the Butcher of Prague? And what if the success of that mission would unleash one of the most brutal manhunts the continent had ever seen? This is the true story of Operation Anthropoid, a mission so improbable, so dangerous, and so bold that even today it reads like the plot of a spy thriller, except every detail is real. When Germany occupied Czechoslovakia in 1939, the nation was carved apart and placed under tight Nazi control. In 1941, Adolf Hitler appointed Reinhard Heydrich as Reichsprotektor over Bohemia and Moravia. Heydrich's name already carried terror across Europe. He had helped create the Gestapo, chaired the Wannsee Conference that coordinated the Holocaust, and was second in command of the SS under Heinrich Himmler. His brutal rule in Prague earned him another title, one whispered in fear by the people who lived under him. They called him the Blonde Beast. His arrival brought mass arrests, executions, and constant surveillance. The Czech resistance was crushed through intimidation and violence. Even the British, watching from afar, understood that Heydrich was not just a high-ranking Nazi official. He was one of the most dangerous men in Hitler's empire. From exile in London, the Czechoslovak government in the United Kingdom knew they needed a dramatic act to prove that Czech resistance still existed. They needed to show the world they had not surrendered their nation's spirit. British intelligence, specifically the Special Operations Executive, agreed to help. The SOE had one mission: to disrupt Nazi operations through sabotage, espionage, and unconventional warfare. Killing Heydrich would send a message to Germany, but even more importantly, it would send a message to the Allies that Czechoslovakia was still in the fight. The mission was soon given a code name, Anthropoid. To carry out the operation, the Czechoslovak government in exile selected two soldiers who had escaped the occupation and made their way to Britain. Their names were Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš. They were young, physically strong, and highly disciplined. Both men volunteered, knowing the mission's survival rate was slim to non-existent. Failure meant torture and death. Success might mean the same thing, but neither hesitated. They believed the liberation of their homeland was worth any price. Training for the operation began in the spring of 1941. Gabčík and Kubiš learned sabotage techniques, explosives handling, urban combat, and covert movement. They practiced firing Sten submachine guns and using modified anti-tank grenades that would later become crucial to the mission. The SOE prepared them for parachuting, coded communication, escape strategies, and the reality that if captured, they could expect no mercy. Their instructors later said both men were among the most focused operatives they had ever trained. Everything about Anthropoid was risky, but one thing was certain: the Czech commandos were ready to face the danger. On the night of December 28, 1941, the operation began. A Royal Air Force Halifax bomber carried Gabčík, Kubiš, and several teams for other missions into the skies over occupied Czechoslovakia. Their drop zone was supposed to be near Pilsen, but poor navigation, darkness, and German-controlled airspace forced the pilot off course. Instead, the men landed miles from their intended location near the village of Nevízdy. It was a dangerous mistake. If German authorities discovered parachutes or gear, the entire mission could collapse before it started. But luck stayed with them that night. Locals sympathetic to the resistance helped conceal the men and smuggled them away before patrols arrived. Over the next several months, Gabčík and Kubiš moved quietly through Prague as the resistance built a support network around them. Safe houses, couriers, and underground contacts took enormous risks assisting the commandos. A single betrayal could doom everything. Still, the mission moved forward. They studied Heydrich's daily routines, the routes he traveled, and the security around him. What they discovered surprised them. Despite his high position and reputation for cruelty, Heydrich traveled with minimal protection. Often he rode in an open-top Mercedes with no escort vehicle. His confidence came from the fear he had created, and that arrogance created an opportunity. The commandos knew they needed a location where Heydrich's car would slow down, giving them a small window to strike. They eventually identified a sharp turn in the Prague district of Liben. The curve forced drivers to reduce speed, and the surrounding streets gave the attackers several escape options. After weeks of surveillance, Anthropoid had the perfect ambush point. As spring 1942 approached, the commandos prepared their weapons. The Sten gun was simple and compact, ideal for covert operations, but prone to jamming. To compensate, they also carried a modified anti-tank grenade housed in a metal cylinder. It had been reinforced to produce more shrapnel. They rehearsed repeatedly, memorizing every movement. For them, the mission was no longer just a military operation, it was personal. Heydrich's brutality had destroyed countless Czech families, and stopping him was a strike on behalf of every victim under his rule. By late May, they were ready. Heydrich's routines were consistent, and they knew he would soon pass the ambush point in his open-top car. The resistance spread lookouts across the district to warn them of approaching German patrols. Gabčík positioned himself at the corner of the curve, his Sten gun concealed under a coat. Kubiš waited a few steps away with the grenade hidden in his briefcase. Once the car slowed, Gabčík would fire. If anything went wrong, Kubiš would throw the grenade. The morning of May 27, 1942, was clear and calm. Heydrich, confident as ever, left his residence with his driver, Johannes Klein. He sat upright in the car, wearing full uniform, unconcerned about the dangers of resistance activity. As the Mercedes approached the curve, Gabčík took his position. This was the moment they had trained for. The entire mission, months of planning and danger, came down to a handful of seconds. As the car slowed for the turn, Gabčík stepped out and raised his weapon. He pulled the trigger. The Sten gun jammed instantly. For a split second, Heydrich and the attackers stared at one another. Heydrich ordered the driver to stop, intending to confront the would-be assassin. That hesitation gave Kubiš the opening he needed. He hurled the grenade toward the vehicle. The blast tore into the rear of the car, ripping metal and upholstery into the air. Shrapnel and fragments from the explosion struck Heydrich, embedding deep into his body. Kubiš was injured by the blast as well, but managed to escape on a bicycle. Gabčík fled on foot as Heydrich, wounded but conscious, staggered out of the car with his pistol drawn. Soldiers and police soon flooded the area, but the commandos were already gone. Heydrich was rushed to a hospital where doctors believed he might survive. But infection spread rapidly, and on June 4, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich died. Operation Anthropoid had succeeded. The celebration would not last. The Nazis prepared to unleash a level of retaliation that would shock even a nation already scarred by occupation. And as the manhunt began, Gabčík and Kubiš would soon find themselves trapped inside a church that would become the site of one of the most heroic final stands of the entire war. Heydrich's death sent shockwaves through the Nazi leadership. Hitler was enraged that one of his most powerful officials had been assassinated in broad daylight inside occupied territory. The response was immediate and merciless. From Berlin came a simple order: find the assassins, destroy their networks, and make the consequences so horrifying that no one in Europe would ever dare attempt something like this again. Within hours of the announcement, the largest manhunt in the history of the Protectorate began. Thousands of SS, Gestapo, and police officers flooded Prague and the surrounding countryside. Roadblocks appeared on every major route. Homes were searched without warning. Identification papers were checked, duplicated, and checked again. Anyone with even a hint of suspicious behavior was arrested. In the first days alone, hundreds were brought in for questioning. Many never returned. The interrogations were brutal, relying on psychological pressure, starvation, and torture. The Nazis believed fear would loosen tongues, and for many it did. Yet none of the early arrests led to the commandos. The resistance worked tirelessly to hide the men responsible. For a time, it seemed the operation might remain an unsolved mystery. The Germans had fragments of clues, but nothing solid enough to follow. But then came the betrayal that changed everything. A paratrooper named Cyril, originally part of another SOE mission, had been hiding since the occupation intensified. Gripped by fear of retribution, he made a decision that would seal the commandos' fate. He went to the Gestapo headquarters in Prague, confessed everything he knew, and provided names, locations, and connections. For the Nazis, it was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Armed with this information, the Gestapo struck swiftly. On June 16th, they surrounded the home of the Moravia family, who had been helping the resistance. The interrogations that followed were ruthless. Under torture and facing the unbearable pressure placed on his family. One member revealed that several paratroopers were hiding in a church in central Prague. The Nazis immediately prepared to attack. St. Cyril and Methodius Cathedral stood on Reslova Street, an ordinary-looking church with a crypt beneath it. The commandos had been using the crypt as a safe hiding place, believing its thick walls and limited access points would protect them if the Germans came. Among those in the church were Josef Gabčík, Jan Kubiš, and several other Czech operatives from different missions. They knew the situation outside was growing more dangerous, but they had no idea how quickly the noose was tightening. At around 4 a.m. on June 18, 1942, German police units quietly surrounded the church. SS General Karl Fischer led the operation, believing that overwhelming force would be enough to subdue the resistance fighters inside. The initial plan was simple: storm the building, capture the paratroopers alive, and interrogate them. The Nazis wanted public confessions, trials, and executions. They wanted to make an example. They had no idea the battle they were about to trigger would become one of the most dramatic and heroic last stands of the entire war. As dawn broke, the assault began. German troops entered the church through the main door, expecting light resistance. Instead, they met concealed gunfire. A group of paratroopers inside the main floor opened fire from balconies and hidden positions. The Germans retreated, shocked by the accuracy and determination of the defenders. These were not civilians with improvised weapons. These were trained soldiers, fighting for their homeland, and they were prepared to hold their ground. Reinforcements arrived, and the Germans escalated their attack. Machine guns were positioned at the entrance. Grenades were thrown inside, yet the defenders continued to hold their positions. The gunfire echoed across the neighborhood, drawing crowds behind cordons as the battle raged on. Smoke filled the church as bullets shattered windows and tore through wooden pews. Still, the commandos refused to surrender. The Germans soon realized they faced a well-organized defense. They shifted tactics and pushed into the choir loft, where 3 paratroopers were holding out. A fierce firefight erupted. Cornered and outnumbered, the men kept shooting until there was no ammunition left. Rather than allow themselves to be captured, they took their own lives. Their stand bought precious time for the remaining fighters hiding in the crypt below. Unable to take the main floor quickly, the SS directed their attention to the crypt. The attackers believed that the remaining assassins were concealed beneath the church. The crypt had only 2 entrances, a small hatch above and a narrow staircase accessible through a side door. Both were choke points, allowing a small number of defenders to hold back a much larger force. When the Germans attempted to descend the stairs, they were met with gunfire that forced them back repeatedly. Frustrated by the resistance, the Nazis began pumping water into the crypt in an attempt to flush the commandos out. They redirected a fire engine hose into the lower level, flooding the space while grenades were dropped through the hatch overhead. Inside the crypt, the commandos were pressed against impossible odds. The water level rose, debris rained from above. They were fighting in near complete darkness, soaked, wounded, and breathing air filled with dust and smoke. Despite the chaos, they held their ground. Every shot they fired was calculated. Every movement was deliberate. They fought for their nation, for each other, and for the mission they had completed at unimaginable cost. Their determination began to anger the Germans, who had expected a quick victory. The longer the battle continued, the more furious the attackers became. SS officers attempted to negotiate, shouting demands for surrender, promising fair treatment if the commandos gave up. The men in the crypt knew these promises meant nothing. They had seen what happened to captured resistance fighters. Surrender was simply another form of execution. They chose to fight until the end. When the water level reached their chests and ammunition dwindled to almost nothing, the surviving commandos faced the final choice. Capture was no longer an option. They gathered what ammunition remained, exchanged final words, and prepared for their last moments. As German forces prepared to breach the crypt, the men used their last bullets on themselves rather than fall into Nazi hands. Their sacrifice marked the end of the battle. By the time the shooting stopped, the church was devastated, the crypt flooded, and the German assault force shaken by the resistance they had encountered. Not a single commando surrendered. Every one of them chose death over capture. In the days that followed, the Nazis continued their campaign of revenge across the Protectorate, The villages of Lidis and Lajaki were wiped from the map. Men were shot, women were deported to camps, and children were taken away. It was one of the most brutal reprisals of the entire war, meant to erase any thought of resistance. But the opposite happened. The courage of Gabčík Kubiš and their fellow commandos inspired resistance movements across Europe. The assassination of Heydrich had not only removed one of the most dangerous figures in Nazi leadership, it proved that even the most oppressive regimes were vulnerable. Operation Anthropoid remains one of the most extraordinary stories of World War II. It was an act of defiance carried out by a small group of determined men who understood the risks and accepted them fully. Their mission changed history, weakened the Nazi command structure, and showed the world the strength of a nation fighting for its survival. Though the cost was immense, their bravery has never been forgotten. Today, memorials stand where the battle took place, honoring the commandos who made their last stand in the crypt of Saints Cyril and Methodius Cathedral. The story of Operation Anthropoid is not a tale of victory in the traditional sense. It is a story of courage, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to freedom. It is a reminder that even in the darkest moments of war, acts of extraordinary heroism can shape the future. And it all began with two men dropped into occupied territory, determined to strike at the heart of tyranny. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like the video, subscribe, and let us know your thoughts in the comments.